Greetings. Welcome back to ITR Live. I'm your host, Chris Hagano, and welcome back to another fun-filled, action-packed episode of Iowa's premier conservative podcast. We've got a very special episode for you today. We are joined here in studio with everyone's favorite Alan Ostergren from the Kirkwood Institute and ITR Foundation President Chris Ingstead. Whew, easy for me to say. Welcome, Alan.
It's great to be back. Thank you.
I can tell you've got you smiling from ear to ear.
I got some awesome merch. I ask and ye shall receive.
Yeah.
And I have to say, you guys nailed it. ITR branded, insulated, little
spill-proof also,
which is I need that. And it Yeti brand. It's very nice. It's going to keep beverages hot or cold, not hot and cold at the same time.
Nope.
I don't think it does that. I'm fired up. I'm going to fill this with my beverage of choice.
Alan, we're movement conservatives. We don't do lukewarm.
I love it.
Well, that's good.
All right.
Well,
Like that? That was. I just pulled that out of nowhere.
I say we end the pod right now.
Right here. We're done.
We're done. Thank you, folks.
All right. So first things first, whenever we have a chance to get Alan here in studio, we need to make sure we touch base on all the important issues of the day. First of all, you've had a chance to look at what's going on in the courtyard. What is your take on this project?
I think this wall was built by Joe Biden. I think.
Oh boy, is that because of all the gaps?
There's some gaps. It's incomplete. You can step over it. No, it's pretty. It's odd.
Pretty odd.
I can't really say what it's going to be.
Yeah.
It's exciting. I like to see it. It's spruced up here, and I look forward to coming back and seeing, what's out there.
Good. Well, I'm sticking with secret underground military installation.
Sure. Let's go with that.
All right. Okay. All right. So we've the merch, which, maybe we should do that someday. Maybe we need to have ITR live and we can sell it or, get people
door prize type things.
Yeah.
Sure.
All right.
Sure.
I think it'd be fun. All right. So Alan, there's a lot going on these days. Property taxes seem to be the issue of the day, both here in Iowa and then I think we're going to come around to a U.S. Supreme Court decision that actually deals with this as well. But I want to get your take on property taxes in Iowa. And you've had a chance to kind of think about the bill that just got passed and, get your own rapid reaction to what was done and what is still left undone.
Well,
is that broad enough for you?
Sure. I think it's a huge accomplishment, and congratulations to ITR for being in the lead on what needs to be reformed in property taxes, and congratulations to the legislators who picked up a tough issue. And it's a complicated system of how we assess property, levy taxes, and then collect those taxes, and to have nearly unanimous support in the legislature for a pretty substantial reform bill that will save Iowans about $100 million off their property taxes, I think is hugely important. I think one of the most exciting parts of it is the part of the bill that will smooth out the growth in property taxes. I think it also makes sense to combine the various different levies into a much easier to understand tax statement. If we get the tax statement in the mail, you look at it, there's a lot of fine print at the bottom of what you're paying for your townships and what you're paying for if you live in a rural area for, your rural services. And in a lot of places like in Des Moines, you're paying for broadlawns, you're paying for this, that, and the other thing. And to combine some of those levies to make it more understandable as to what ends up being your final tax bill, I think is important. People don't always realize with property taxes, the time factor involved in it. We were talking about this before we started recording, that, we all got our assessments in the mail a few weeks ago. Mine went up about 19%. I think that's pretty consistent with what we saw in Polk County and other places around the state. So that's a number based on what the assessor thinks my property is worth January 1, 2023. That number is going to drive a budget that starts July 1, 2024 that I'll pay half of in September of 24 and the other half of in March of 2025. And you think about how much interest rates have changed, how the housing market can change, and all those things, and you're picking out a point in time saying your house is worth this is the number, and then that carries over for a year and a half. It's a difficult system for people to understand. So I think it's good to get some simplicity to it, more transparency, the fact that there's going to be notification to taxpayers as to what's going on with their property taxes.
Yeah, by the way, I just want to interject. All transparency is good, but transparency and clarity over what it's going to do to each individual's, property or parcel is really key. Because the nebulous number about how much a city is planning to spend, nobody cares. What's it mean to me? And I think this legislation is going to answer that question for folks.
Absolutely. And it's, you can see in the paper, Des Moines' budget was what, I think 350 million. I think was that what they, something like, don't quote me on that. But you see that number, but it's hard to get in your head how many other taxpayers just like you are out there, how many commercial properties are out there. And we spend our lives, going to our job, running our business, taking care of our family budget. We don't necessarily think about what's the county's tax base and how does this all divide out. So I think you're exactly right. Getting a piece of paper in the mail that says, here's what your number is and here's how it was calculated is really important.
I think in addition to the individual parcel or individual taxpayer information, is the information will land at a time that someone can do something about it.
Yep.
So you get your property tax assessment notice in the mail. Unless you intend to protest that assessment, it really holds no meaning because there's no courthouse to storm. There's no hearing to go to. You're done. There's no decisions being made until next February or whenever it might be. And so you give this notice will go at a time that somebody can open it, read it, and think, oh yeah, the hearing is in 2 weeks. I better show up. Right. So we like that as well. So yeah, I think the notification piece is exceptionally important. Okay, so it's a great thing. Is this the biggest conservative reform of the session?
No, that's going to be education reform, which will probably be the biggest conservative reform of our lifetimes, actually. I mean, tax reform is great, but the structural change to the government school monopoly, I think, is something that is going to last long after us and is hugely important. And also, ultimately, I think will be part of the conversation of how do you reduce the tax burden for the cost of education, because we're going to see that the private sector delivers a better product at less cost to Iowa families. That's a policy debate that's going to happen down the road. But I think education reform was hugely important. This property tax bill is hugely important. I hope the legislature saved a few things to do next session for other reforms. I believe I was on the pod last fall, and we talked about like what this 90th General Assembly could look like if the poll numbers turned out to be correct, and they did turn out to be correct. And I think this has turned out to be one of the most significant legislative sessions ever. Last year, in the 89th, we had historic tax reform, and then this year, historic education reform, property tax reform, regulatory reform, the reforms to the educational system that give parents more control, more rights over what happens in their public schools. All this stuff is hugely important. And I think conservatism is on the march in the state of Iowa, which is good.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. My question was obviously loaded, and yes, this is a meaningful property tax bill. But it's what will get talked about as the legislature moves towards adjournment for the year. But the magnitude of that education reform package, it dwarfs anything else around it in terms of its importance to the future of, the state of Iowa. So I agree completely, and I think once we get further out, that will be the thing that certainly gets remembered. So looking forward to next year, Alan, I mean, I'm glad you brought that up. I do think there will be some big issues for the legislature to continue to look at. Both Senate Ways and Means Chairman Dan Dawson and House Ways and Means Chairman Bobby Kaufman both indicated that their work on property taxes is not done yet, and that they will continue to work on this issue next year. And which is, I think, encouraging, because as an organization, we've mentioned that we thought this was a multi-year process of trying to tackle the issue, and hopefully they can continue to work on some of these ideas that have moved forward this year, leave behind some of the ones that probably weren't quite as excited about. So, but that'll be good. And I also, it seems as if income tax reform is absolutely on the table for next year. And working on that. And that could be another very significant bill. So those are on there. And then you and I talked a little bit yesterday about a couple of things that maybe the legislature could do next year that would be meaningful conservative reforms. I know specifically on judicial nomination. There's room to work there.
Absolutely. I think that is an area that the legislature needs to give some attention to, looking at how do we generate the list of names that go to the governor. There's been some proposals on that. There's been some reforms passed that deal with how the state judicial nominating commission process works and structured, giving the governor an additional appointee and taking an associate justice off the commission. They've not reformed the district court nomination process. And I think we're getting to a point where the legislature really needs to take a more comprehensive look at judicial selection reform, where in our process, we give lawyers a very privileged place to elect half the commission members at the district court level and almost half the commission members at the state level. And here's the thing that's interesting about those elections. Now, this is, by the way, the dream way for the left how you conduct an election. No voter ID. You can vote from your desk electronically. You just log in and click a few names, and your vote is done. It's about as easy as it can be.
It is.
And lawyers don't participate in those elections very much at all. The turnout in some district court nominating commissioner races, the lawyers electing another lawyer to serve on the commission to pick the people who go to the governor to be selected to be a judge. Some of those are 10% turnout, 15% turnout.
Well, I can tell you, I do not vote in all of them. If I don't know who the folks are, for the district court level, I've left that blank regularly. And I'll admit that. Yeah.
And there was an election, I won't say, I think it was in the 3rd Judicial District, I believe, a few years back, to fill a vacancy. So, it came up at maybe not the normal time, but still, to fill a vacancy on the Judicial Nominating Commission, 2 people ran for that position. The result of the election was a tie. 1-1. Okay. Now, I want to say to these candidates, if you want a political consultant to help you whip votes so you can win that race, hit me up. My DMs are open. We can talk. But
was there a really contentious recount in that? Like trying to figure out whether ones were the actual count?
I don't know if it was audited. I don't know if there was a steal to be stopped. I don't really know what happened with that. I just know it was 1-1. It reminds me. I'm going to digress here for a second. From back when I was a county attorney in Muscatine County, and I'm not going to say the name of the small town in the county, but the local option sales tax came up for renewal, and I think this has changed now, but you had to vote every 10 years, I think, to reauthorize your local option sales tax. And the local option sales tax renewal in this small town failed. Would you gentlemen like to guess what the vote was by which it failed?
1-1.
0-0.
That's awesome.
Not a single person in the town showed up to vote. And if one person had gotten off their bar stool and gone and voted, they would have renewed the local option sales tax, but nobody did. So it failed, and then they had to get back on the ballot the next opportunity they could. But anyway, the legislature needs to reform this process. Lawyers do not take seriously the special position they have. It is, frankly, a very strange system where lawyers are in this privileged position that we're the only people who can vote in a certain election.
can I? Okay, is providing one class of citizen an extra share in determining a branch of government, is that constitutional?
As courts have interpreted the Constitution on this question, the answer is yes. Can that interpretation be squared with the originalist understanding of the Constitution? Probably not. But challenges to this process have failed in court, which is too bad. But that just because the courts won't step in to stop it doesn't mean the legislature can't.
Large courts made up of
Right.
judges who were selected out of the process, which
Right.
is being challenged.
There are, I don't know how technical you want to get here. So in the 60s, the Warren Court said one person, one vote, and that's why, you don't have one senator for every 2 counties in Iowa anymore, those kinds of things. So to elect representatives of the people, the Supreme Court said one person, one vote. That principle doesn't apply in judicial elections because the court has said judges are not representatives of the people, which I don't agree with at all. But that is the prevailing precedent on that.
Yeah.
And that's why those challenges have failed. But still, the legislature can fix this process. So now I'm in the privileged group. So I get to say, I don't think I should have more say in the process than 3 million Iowans do who don't have a law degree and aren't admitted to practice law in the courts of this state. I don't think I should have that privileged position. I think you should open that election to everybody or do something to make it more democratically accountable. And I have some thoughts, and other people have had some thoughts on how to reform this. It's definitely one of the conservative reforms that can happen next session. I think regulatory reform, this legislature needs to abolish our certificate of need process. That is low-hanging fruit. It's the easiest kind of reform statute to draft. Chapter whatever it is in the code is repealed, poof, gone. Just cut the whole thing out at the root and burn it. We need to not indulge this idea that because you sell healthcare services that you have to get permission from your competitor in order to provide more services to consumers.
And why should the average Iowan care about that issue?
Because you care about whether you can deliver a baby in your local hospital. You care about whether you get your cataracts removed and you go to a local clinic where it costs a third or half of what it costs to do at a hospital. There's lots of states that don't have certificate of need laws. They have just as good or better access to health care. And these are rural states, urban states, you name it. The certificate of need process is one of these things where government shoots itself in the foot over and over again. And we just need to just end the whole thing. And so I hope that, Brad Zahn, one of my favorite people in the Senate, has a bill he introduces every year to repeal this. I hope that gets some traction, and it needs to be passed. And there's, I think, other regulatory things we can go back and look. The governor imposed kind of a soft moratorium on new regulations. I think that was a good idea. And just asking ourselves the question, what does it cost to comply with all of the rules that are out there, and do these rules actually make sense? It's a very valuable process to go through.
Yep.
Great. Yeah.
Well, West Virginia got rid of, if not the entire certificate of need process, a big chunk of it. So it is not, breaking new ground to go ahead and get rid of these bad policies. And it's one that we should really take a look at in Iowa and push through the process. I mean, there were some certificate of need reforms that took a few steps this year, but I don't think, unless somebody's got some insider info, I don't think any of that's going to get finalized this year. So let's come back next year and push it out of the way, because when is competition, bad for the consumer? In this case, a healthcare consumer.
No, that's right.
This is a requirement that originally the federal government imposed through the Medicaid and Medicare systems on states. And even the federal government could figure out this is stupid, right? I mean, when have you heard of a federal government program ending because it was a bad idea, right? How often does that happen? And yet this zombie law continues to exist. That we enacted this law because the feds made us do it. The feds stopped making states do it, like in 1980 or so, roughly. and yet it just carries on, and all it does is employ lawyers to do a bunch of pointless legal work
or benefit the existing healthcare facilities that don't have to have the competition.
Well, sure. And the existing healthcare facilities who, on one day are asking for a certificate and being told by their competitors, no, you can't possibly have this. And then the next day their competitor wants to do something and they're in the administrative hearing saying, oh, this is terrible competition. So there's a lot of shifting viewpoints depending on what day it is.
Good. Okay. I want to close with just if we could touch on this property tax sale case that was before the U.S. Supreme Court, because it was really interesting to me, and I didn't read the decision. I read the article that you sent me on it, but really could have some pretty significant implications if this decision looks like it's going to come down the way that the oral arguments indicated that it would.
Yeah, there was a case last week with oral arguments. It's out of Michigan. And in summary, Michigan has a system for collecting property taxes like a lot of states, where if you are delinquent on your property taxes, eventually the government comes in and takes your property from you and auctions it off. And in that situation, this elderly woman who had some health issues and other things going on fell behind on her taxes. And the government comes in. It's a condo she's living in that probably is really worth about $90,000. She owes about $12,000 to $15,000 in delinquent taxes. The condo sells at an auction for $40,000. Okay, so it's obviously way below the market value. And then to add insult to injury, under the law of that state, the government keeps the overage. Right? It's not just the government collects its past due taxes; it keeps all of the money from the auction. She gets nothing at that point. So there's oral argument on that. I think all the reporting indicates that the oral argument went very badly for the government in that case, which is good. If any other situation, if you're trying to collect on a debt, like if you had $50,000 in your bank account and the debt was $10,000, they can take the $10,000 from the bank. They can garnish the bank and get your money, but they don't get the all $50,000 in your bank account. Right? It's just not how that works. It's somehow your house has less protection than your bank account would. It makes no sense. Well, here's the rub. If and when sometime this year the decision comes down that this is unconstitutional, we're going to have to take a very hard look at our Iowa property tax collection system, because we have something that's a little bit different.
A little bit different. The government doesn't get the overage. Right. It's the individual.
It's an investor.
Right.
We have and actually the notices would have just gone out for a tax sale that will happen in June, I believe. And delinquent taxes, basically you can bid at an auction to buy a tax sale certificate. You pay the delinquent taxes, then you have to pay several more tax installments. The person has a right to redeem during that time period and pays a really high interest rate to the tax sale certificate purchaser. At the end of that process, though, if you haven't redeemed, the certificate purchaser goes to the treasurer and gets a treasurer's deed. They own the property free and clear. Okay. So I think we're going to have to confront the fact that probably that mechanism, now it's not government taking ultimately the property. There's no question government has the right to collect the taxes. They are a lien on the property. And we want
government to be able to collect the delinquent taxes. That's
and by the way, for the listeners, for the tens of thousands of people listening to this podcast,
do not joke about the size of our audience, Alan.
So
we got a lot of people out there.
Mr. and Mrs. Henriksen, I know you live in Minnesota, but I am not saying don't pay your taxes.
Right.
Right. I mean, this is not legal advice to be a tax cheat or scofflaw or ignore your tax bill or anything like that. The legislature, I think, is going to have to address how does this collection mechanism work? Because if this Supreme Court case goes the way that it really looks like it's going to, our tax sale certificate system is going to have to change. And if you're a tax sale purchaser, it's going to change the incentives. Now, you don't go into the tax sale because you want to end up owning a piece of property. You want the person to redeem. Okay.
Correct.
Right. But we're going to have to really address, depends on how the court writes that up, is that going
Yeah.
to completely destroy our tax sale certificate system or merely put a big dent in it?
Now we're getting really down in the weeds on an issue that I'm not sure everyone's really excited about, but I'm all for reforming the current tax sale system for a number of reasons. I don't think it works particularly well, and I think a lot of it is a scam for counties to try and scoop up a bunch of these bids from these out-of-state companies that come in and scoop up all the tax certificates. But set that aside. I had in my legal practice once an individual who was much like the woman who was in the U.S. Supreme Court decision. It was a retiree, had owned the property outright, didn't pay the property taxes for whatever reason, and lost it. And the buyer of the certificate had the deed for the property, and then wakes up and says, well, wait a minute, you mean I'm losing my house? You probably should pay those property taxes before you get to that part where you look like, your property's been deeded away. And now, thankfully, in that situation, the company that had bought the certificate was in that situation like you described, where we don't really want the property and we don't want to have to dispose of this thing. We just want the money. And so they still extended the opportunity to pay it off with all their costs and walked away. And it ended up being a pretty good outcome. But no one should be able to, whether it's government or the investor in the tax certificate, to become enriched at that debtor's expense on that other part. So I think that you're right. I suspect that the U.S. Supreme Court I would support their decision, but it's going to require a pretty radical reform to that system, even here in Iowa.
Yes, the government needs to be able to collect the money. As somebody I will pay my tax bill voluntarily on time in full. I want other people to do that too, because
Yes.
I don't want my taxes to go up because people start ignoring
Correct.
their system. And if you look at dysfunctional countries around the world, one of the biggest signs of a dysfunctional country is widespread tax evasion.
Yes.
Right. And we don't really have that problem in this country.
Yep.
And we don't want to ever be in a situation where we encourage it by arcane and unfair tax laws.
As much as we will advocate for and fight for lower taxes for everyone, we absolutely believe that everyone ought to pay the taxes that are due. So we will argue that position at the same time, right?
Yep.
Yeah. I'm probably butchering the movie reference. It's a little bit like the color guy in Major League opposite Bob Uecker.
Oh,
Yeah.
yeah.
And are you familiar with that?
Of course I am.
Okay. That's kind of what I feel like you're giving me today.
Well, you're no Harry Doyle, so I don't know what you want out of me. But
All right, Alan.
This is two obscure movie references in a row on the podcast.
Spies Like Us in Major League.
Just a bit outside.
Yeah.
I don't know that I care for you calling Major League an obscure movie reference, Alan, but we'll cover that off air. So
It was too high. It was
All
too.
right.
It was too high.
Okay.
Too high.
All right. Well, with that, unfortunately, I think it's time to sign off, Alan. So appreciate you coming in.
It's always a pleasure.
We need to do this more often. So I know you're a very busy guy, but anytime you can carve 20, 30 minutes out of your schedule, we would love to have you. Do not expect to get new merch every time you come in, but we will try and do our best to make it worth your while.
I appreciate it, guys.
All right. Thank you. Thank you, everyone. Thanks for joining us. Don't forget to like and subscribe and tell your friends. And with that, we will see you next time on ITR Live.